Welcome to Lady Justice, Women of the Court, a podcast hosted by Women State Supreme Court Justices and produced in partnership with the National Center for State Courts. In each episode, our hosts Justice Rhonda Wood of Arkansas and Justice Beth Walker of West Virginia discuss the law and its real-world implications for listeners of all ages. Join us for another insightful and inspiring conversation.
Welcome to Season 5 of Lady Justice, Women of the Court. I am Justice Rhonda Wood of the Arkansas Supreme Court, and I'm thrilled to be back with, I dare say, believe it or not, Beth, I never thought we'd be here to Season 5 of Lady Justice with my good friend, Justice Beth Walker of the Supreme Court of Appeals of West Virginia. And we are certainly stronger than ever with our friends and partners now at the National Center for State Courts. Beth, can you believe we are at year 5 talking about state courts? And do you feel like the rest of the country is just catching up and figuring out how cool we are?
Well, we are. I can't believe we're at year 5 first. And good morning. It's great to see you, my friend. It has gone so quickly, and yeah, I think maybe we were cool about state courts before everybody else was. And I'm going to say that we should take credit for leading the interest in what state courts do and how important state courts are and how influential state courts can be. So let's just make that something we did and move on from there. So I'm excited and certainly grateful, as you said, for the support we're getting from the National Center to help make this podcast better and help us continue to be great.
Yeah, well, I think since if you're the only one out there, you can say you started it. So that's fair game. Well, we start every season with Constitution Day. And in the past, we'd had some phenomenal guests, including Jeffrey Rosen and Judge Jeffrey Sutton. This year, we do not have a Jeffrey on. But who better than Constitution Day than the director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution? So yes, today we are joined by Randy Barnett, the Patrick Hotung Professor of Constitutional Law at Georgetown and director of its center. And I love the name, it's the Center for the Constitution. So welcome, Randy.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me. And speaking of West Virginia, I'm taking my brother there for his 70th birthday, and we're having one day on the racetrack at the Summit Point racetrack, which I'll be driving my car. He'll be driving a rental car. And the next day we're doing we're getting some tactical firearms instruction from Paramount Tactical, which is a West Virginia firm that I do business with. So anyway, I'm looking forward to Wild and Wonderful in West Virginia.
Well, we are looking forward to hosting you for sure. That is a great business of West Virginia. It's among many others, but we're always glad to have folks in. There's wonderful tours in West Virginia. Although I just finished this sort of cross-country trip, and there's wonderful tours in a lot of states, as I have learned. And maybe we'll talk about that on a future podcast. But today we're emphasizing the Constitution.
Well, and I'm a little jealous. I've been to West Virginia to go see Beth, so it's a beautiful part of the country. So I'm sure you'll have fun. I'll be interested to see some pictures, Randy, of some of those experiences of our videos. But I'm going to brag a little bit for our listeners and acknowledge that Beth and I know Randy, and we are so excited that he has come on our podcast. But we want anyone who isn't familiar with Randy, who has maybe not listened to any newscast about any major constitutional law case in the last century, we want them to know a little bit more about Randy. Randy is an esteemed constitutional law expert. His publications include at least 12 books, more than 100 articles and law reviews, many op-eds. And if you want to know the 100 Supreme Court cases that everyone should know and that you should know, Randy wrote a book for that called An Introduction to Common Law, the 100 Supreme Court cases everyone should know. And if you want to know the original meaning behind the 14th Amendment, he wrote a book for that too. And that is obviously the title. So I could go on because there, as we said, are more than a dozen. He has also argued before the United States Supreme Court, but he started his career in Cook County of Illinois, and his latest book is A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist. And Randy, you know that we are some of the elected state justices, And so we are used to giving elevator pitches. So I'm going to ask you, what's your elevator pitch or synopsis about your book?
Right. Well, thank you for having me on again, and very excited to talk about the book. It's a book I wrote for my grandchildren so that they would know what their grandfather did. But in the course of writing it, I discovered that it's actually a narrative of how we came to have a more originalist Supreme Court. It tells the story about how I first became a libertarian, and then I became a constitutional conservative, and finally how I became an originalist. And then during the course of being a law professor, developing the theory of originalism, we have now, it talks about, the role that I played in having people who are appointed to the Supreme Court who are self-identified originalists, and how, for example, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky was one of the senior advisors to him on his political campaign, and he invited me to vet to his interview with both Justices Kavanaugh and Justices Barrett when they were being nominated. So there's a lot of stories about that and how we came to the point that we're currently at. It's the story of modern political libertarianism, but it's also the story of modern originalism. So maybe before you ask me any other questions, I should define originalism for your listeners.
Absolutely.
Sounds like a great
Yes.
idea. It's a word that, I'll just say it's a word that was not used commonly when I started practicing law, although it was certainly maybe out there in the early 90s, but now it seems so commonplace. So let us know, and maybe you should take credit for that.
Well, the term was invented by a critic of two people, Robert Bork and Raoul Berger. He invented the term originalism. This is a man named Paul Brest, who was a professor at Stanford. He invented the term originalism to criticize these positions. And it was in 1980. We can date the beginning of that term to 1980 to a critic of originalism, having invented the term. And then after that, people started saying, no, I am an originalist. And they went on from there. And they absorbed the term, and now it's a very, very popular term. The meaning of that can be summarized in a single sentence, and that is that the meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. So it's a pretty simple concept. Even though the term originalism is modern, the idea that the meaning of a document, the meaning of a contract, the meaning of a constitution, the meaning of a private letter is fixed at the time it's enacted. And then under our constitutional order, all constitutional actors who gain power pursuant to the Constitution and take an oath to it, take an oath to follow, they ought to follow the meaning that's fixed in the written Constitution. It's important because this is the way that the Constitution can provide the law that governs those who govern us. I mean, the legislatures of the states and the Congress, they make laws to govern us. The courts pass upon those laws, and there's also common law that's developed by state courts that govern us. But what governs those who govern us? The Constitution is the document or the device that was invented to make law that would govern those who govern us, and those who are to be governed by that law, you and the legislatures and the executive branch, the governors in your states, those are to be governed by the law that governs them, can no more make up the meaning of the law that governs them and change it as they see fit than we, the people, can make up the laws that they impose on us, or change the laws to something we like better without going through the legislative process. So that's originalism. It's the beginning of an answer as to why one should be an originalist. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think that's enough to get us started.
Well, thank you for kind of going through that. And I wanted to key in on, something we've talked about time and again on this podcast on our Constitution Day episodes, is one of the major differences between the state constitutions and the federal constitution is that the state constitutions can be and are amended on a regular basis. And as opposed to the federal constitution, which, as you referenced in your summation of originalism, there is a mechanism to change the federal constitution. One could argue that mechanism is set forth in the Constitution and is not intended to be by decisions of courts. And so I hear that's what I'm kind of hearing you saying. Is that a fair sort of interpretation?
Absolutely fair. But it's because the courts have, in fact, been modifying or amending the Constitution on their own that it's taken a lot of the impetus away from the amendments process. having a constitutional amendment didn't used to be as extraordinary an event as it now has become. There are 27 amendments. I mean, obviously, the first 10 got done right away, but then there were 17 over the years, very important ones. You have the 14th Amendment that was referenced earlier, about which I have a book on what its original meaning is. The 15th Amendment protected voting in cases of race. We have the Income Tax Amendment, the Women's Vote Amendment. There's been a lot of changes to the Constitution. The Constitution that originalists defend today, and that judges and constitutional actors are bound to follow today, is not the original Constitution as it existed in 1787. It is the Constitution that's been amended 27 times that exists today. And so that's a very important point in understanding what it is that originalists say judges and all other constitutional actors need to follow.
Well, and I think that, sitting where we are in state courts, I know that every 2 years, our court's in the middle of that right now. Every 2 years, there are, anywhere from 1 to 5 amendments sort of put forth to the voters for our state constitution. And some people argue that that process is too difficult and burdensome, and some say it's too easy. And that's not for us to weigh in on, but from a state justice and constitution standpoint, everybody's pretty familiar with it and used to that process. You don't like something, there's a process, but people have sort of fallen away from what you've said, is understanding that the federal constitution really had the same process, in a sense that there's a way to do it by either Congress has a mechanism path, the people have a path, the state conventions have a path, but we've sort of fallen away from that. Well, and I want to talk, more specifics about your book too. And one of the things that really struck, and I'll kind of let Beth talk about, was mentoring that helped you get to where you are in this position on originalism. So Beth?
Yeah. So, well, I was just going to ask, one thing we talk about on this podcast all the time, and Randy, I'm sure you've listened to all of our episodes, so you know this, but we talk about being first generation lawyers, and, folks who found their way to the law and found their way to judging, not by virtue of some sort of family mentorship, but by incredible people we encountered along the way of our education and our profession, who helped us move forward. And you give generous credit in this very personal memoir, I would call it in some ways, to mentors. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how mentors matter, and particularly how you advise others to seek out mentors, because we get asked all the time, how do I find a mentor? How do you, what's the process of locating a mentor? And we talk about how it's usually kind of not planned. But could you talk a little bit about that? Because I love those portions of your book.
Well, thank you. There were surprises in writing a memoir. I never really thought about what it was going to be like. And one of the surprises is that the memoir turned out to be a story of thank yous to all the people who made me the man that I am, and beginning with my father. So I'm an individualist. I believe in individual rights. I believe that the individual person, as the Declaration of Independence affirms, is the basic unit that needs to flourish, and the Constitution and natural rights are the means by which one gets to flourish. But nevertheless, we are social animals. We are individuals who need others, and really wouldn't be where we are. None of us would be where we are without the people that are in our lives. And I've been very blessed by having a series of mentors, starting with my father, then going to my grade school band instructor, then my high school debate coach, and into college, where a very important man, Henry Veach, a Aristotelian Thomist philosopher, took me under his wing when I was a mere freshman in college, and treated me like a grad student. And as a result of that, I became enamored with natural law, and then later on with natural rights. It just continues on and on. It's a very good question as to how you do it. I do think, and by the way, as you know from the book, it tells an example of where I tried to get a mentor, in particular, my criminal law professor, who spurned me completely. And it really was a bad thing for me because I went into the teaching market. I needed a reference from law school, and he was the guy who should have been my reference, and he refused to be a reference for me. That was very disappointing. That was my one failure to obtain a mentor. But you just need to, I think, demonstrate that you deserve it. You deserve their attention by being respectful and being a good student in the sense that you're striving. They can sense that you're striving to, not for perfection. Nobody gets that, but you're striving to be excellent. That was true of my band instructors. It was true of my high school debate instructor. It's true of Henry Veach, my philosophy professor. They sensed my desire for knowledge and for learning and to do it right. And they appreciate it. Now, the thing is not everybody wants a protege. Mentors on the one side and proteges on the other. And not every person who you might want to have mentor you cares to have a protege. So it is a matter of luck. But then you have to be a good protege, and you have to give back to the person who's being your mentor by your respect and by the effort that you put in to whatever it is that person is mentoring you on. And I should also mention that I have had women mentors as well as male mentors in the course of becoming a lawyer. And that was also a very important part of my formative career. When I was modeling my closing argument style, which everybody does by looking at other people and borrowing, there was at least one, there were two actually, but one in particular, women prosecutors which were much more rare in the 70s than they are today, who I thought her closing argument style was really quite appealing. And I borrowed some aspects of her closing argument style for my own.
Well, and certainly, I think you touched on, the protege giving back as well, and it being sort of this, give and take and balance. But I think sometimes it's almost dangerous to say, yes, I'll be a mentor to someone, and then not have the time and not be willing to devote it, and sort of misleading them in that path. So, I mean, Beth and I have always talked, and we talk on here a lot about how important it is to mentor, and how we wish we had, more mentors coming through. But at the same time, it's like, you've got to be willing to actually take the time and do it correctly and do it well, so that you can kind of, hopefully pay it forward in the correct manner. Not just let them sort of follow you around, because we've seen that kind of mentorship as well. And I will say, everyone needs to, I'm not just plugging his book to plug his book. It was so interesting and so it was great from a constitutional law scholar. I love that part of it, but it also is just very touching and heartwarming to hear your stories. And I don't think it's just because of knowing you personally, but hearing everything just from how you met your wife, and maybe some mistakes you made in dating before you met your wife. But I wish we had time to really go into all of that, but we have limited time.
I didn't put all my mistakes in dating into the book. Just the one.
Yeah. And that's part of being a good lawyer, is knowing, how to, and you're a good writer, you know how to edit. But we have very limited time today. And I think from the book, one of the really turning points for you to becoming the constitutional expert that you are today was really when you sort of became the Ninth Amendment constitutional law expert. And so, to the extent you can do it in this, podcast, but I think it's a good example too on how sometimes you accidentally fall into a path in something, and that's important to say. You don't really plan your whole life. So could you talk about that, about how that sort of happened and you became this Ninth Amendment expert?
Well, it's a long story, and so I can't tell it all on the podcast. That's the reason I had to write a book. I had to write a book because I have all these long stories, and I'll never be able to tell my grandchildren them. So I had to write it all down for them. Otherwise, I'd never hear them, and they'd be lost.
Well, you can tease it.
I'll tease it. I mean, basically, the Ninth Amendment played a very important role in my development, because when I was a law student, let me say what the Ninth Amendment is. I defined originalism in one sentence. The Ninth Amendment is only one sentence, and it says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, other rights retained by the people. It doesn't say rights there, but that's what the Ninth Amendment says. Now, when I was a law student and I was taking constitutional law from Larry Tribe at Harvard Law School, I was casebook, the Gunther casebook. I would go through the casebook and I would get to parts of the Constitution that I thought were really great. Like I'm a big Second Amendment fan. That's one of them. But I got to the part about the Ninth Amendment, and as I didn't know that much about the Constitution. I liked it. I was an American patriot. I liked the Constitution, but I didn't know much about it. I read the Ninth Amendment. I go, wow, this is a fantastic amendment. This is great. It means that the rights that we have are not limited to the ones that are mentioned in the first 10 amendments. And then I would turn the page of the casebook, and here, like elsewhere, I found that the court said, yeah, but that doesn't mean anything. And as you both know, the Ninth Amendment is not used by the courts, and it's not something that's enforced. It's something that's sort of part of our forgotten, or what I call the lost Constitution. One of the names of my books is Restoring the Lost Constitution, which is not constitutional law from before the New Deal. It is all the clauses of the Constitution that the Supreme Court has ignored, or ignored the original meaning of. The Ninth Amendment is one of them. But I became so disgusted with the Supreme Court's neglect of these lost clauses as a law student that I sort of gave up on the Constitution altogether, and thought, well, it was a nice idea, but it hasn't worked out, has it? It's kind of been a failed experiment. And I pursued my pre-existing career path, which was to become a criminal lawyer, a criminal trial lawyer, which in my mind meant a real lawyer. No offense to law office lawyers, but I just felt trial lawyers were real lawyers. And I became that. And then when I became a law professor, being a constitutional law professor was the last thing I could imagine being, because I thought, well, that was a waste of time. I became a contracts professor, where the law matters and the law actually is reasonably good, and the writings are taken seriously in contracts. So that's what I became. And I only got pulled into constitutional law because I got invited to give a talk at the 5th annual Student Symposium of the Federalist Society, which did not exist when I was a law student, at Stanford. And it was a panel on the First Amendment. The whole conference was a conference on the First Amendment. There was a panel on freedom of association. And as I was writing, at first I didn't want to accept the invitation because it was a constitutional law and I didn't do that. But the student who was inviting me said, oh, you're a smart guy. You only have to talk for 10 minutes. You can think of something to say. And there were all these fancy people that were going to be on the program. And I was a junior professor. I wanted to be with them. So I said, oh, okay, I'll try. And as I was polling, thinking through this problem of freedom of association, and it dawned on me that the First Amendment does not mention freedom of association. It talks about freedom of speech, press, and assembly, but not freedom of association. But nevertheless, the courts do protect freedom of association, ostensibly under the First Amendment, even though it's not mentioned. And so the punchline of my talk was, well, in the Constitution, it says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, speech, press, and assembly, should not be construed to deny or disparage others, freedom of association, retained by the people. That was my punchline, but the truth is I knew nothing about it. I got a great reception at this convention, much to my surprise. And I went back to my home school of Chicago Kent College of Law, and I thought, well, do I want to do any more about this or don't I? And I thought, okay, well, I thought for myself, there's two things I calculated, because I think to be a professional, an academic, you need to be a little bit savvy over what's in your interest to do, what'll get you ahead, what'll make an impact, and what will not. I knew the Ninth Amendment was sort of disreputable, normally something you wouldn't want to talk about and be taken seriously. But number one, I had tenure. And so by this time, I think I could talk about, sort of whatever I wanted to. And number two is there were a lot of people who were interested in unenumerated rights. And I thought that if, the people who control the intellectual agenda in law schools were interested in unenumerated rights, maybe they'd be interested in the Ninth Amendment. So I put together a number of projects on the Ninth Amendment. I had an article published in the Cornell Law Review. I had a book contract from George Mason Press to do an anthology of previously published scholarship. And I had a symposium issue of the Chicago Kent Law Review set up where I edited it and invited all these people to write about the Ninth Amendment, all these established scholars. So it would not just be me writing about it, but now I would have the other people writing about it too. And that's kind of how it all began. That was my opening wedge. But at that point in my career, it's really the only thing I knew anything about was this one obscure provision. And, I've learned a few things since then.
Well, what
Yeah,
is,
thanks.
oh, go ahead, Rhonda.
No, go ahead, Beth.
What is remarkable and that you haven't really given yourself, at least in this interview, as much credit for as I've observed is, as you tell your stories and as I read the book, you don't do anything sort of halfway. If you're going to become the Ninth Amendment person you talk about, you dove in and you figured it out. And that's just such an important lesson because, there is luck and opportunity, and you have to know, as you say, when your opportunities are and take them. But you also, sometimes you just have to work hard and dig in and learn something that you don't know, which can be intimidating. And I'm sure as a tenured professional, you thought, well, maybe part of you could have said, I'm already an expert on several things. I don't need to be an expert on this. So I love how you model, without saying it, the value of just, digging in and working hard.
Well, there's a converse to that as well, Beth, and that is that you have to be careful about what you don't know. There's one of my favorite lines from one of the Dirty Harry movie series, which is a man's got to know his limitations, which is why I turn down most press inquiries, because they're asking me about stuff that I don't consider myself an expert on. And I'm constantly passing up opportunities to speak. Harvard Law School just invited me yesterday to a big program they're going to have in the fall on the administrative state and what the future of the administrative state is. Now, I have my own opinions about that. Some of them are really actually kind of strong opinions about that, but this is not my area of expertise. I don't study the administrative state. There are other people who do. And I politely declined what I thought would be a very attractive, flattering invitation to be on this program because it just wasn't my area. And then I recommended Philip Hamburger at Columbia, and that's somebody who is his area. And I hope they invite him instead of me. So I do think it's important, not to be a dilettante, which is what you were talking about, to dive into, to really be serious about whatever you are prepared to opine on. And then the more I know about some things, the less I believe I know about everything else. When I was younger, I knew everything. And the older I get and the more I know, the less I feel I know. Because it reveals how ignorant you are, or I am, about all the things that I'm not an expert on. And therefore, I kind of have to keep those views to myself.
Well, I think that's very well said, and probably one of the great lesson people could take from this and learn, sort of when not to speak. I will say that we have a lot of Arkansas listeners because, of course, having ties to the Arkansas Supreme Court. And when you talk about that Ninth Amendment story and how you were invited to be part of that panel, in the book, you mention who was on the panel, and one of the individuals on that panel was Morris Arnold, who everyone in Arkansas in the legal community will know. And so I will tell you that I plan to talk to him to find out his take on how that all went down and what he thought about sort of how that conference went. So I can't wait to visit with them. And when I do, I'll let you know how that went.
Well, I have a Buzz Arnold story that that was not in the book. It might have gone in the book, but the book got too long. And that is, I had a student at Northwestern who came to see me a lot in office hours. I visited at Northwestern when I was on the faculty of Chicago teaching contracts. And I had one student, African-American young man, who came to see me a lot in my office, and I was very impressed with. And I asked him if he ever thought about being an academic. And he said, "Oh, no, and that's not for him. It has no interest in that kind of thing." He had all these plans to be a lawyer in his community, and I respected that. But I was very impressed with him. And then by the time he was graduating as a third-year student, I asked him, "Do you have a clerkship lined up?" And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that." I said, "Well, I think you should get a clerkship, because I'm thinking this guy would really make a good law professor one day." And so at that time, I really was not very well connected. I was not that much of a constitutional law professor, hardly at all. I'm still, in my contract law phase. But there was one person who was a circuit court judge who I knew, because he'd formerly been a law professor at Indiana University, and that is Morris Buzz Arnold. And I knew him when he was a law professor. And so I called him up. I called up his chambers. And actually, I found out years later, the person that answered the phone was his current law clerk at that time, named Ann Coulter. Yes, the Ann Coulter. I, of course, did not know, or did not remember her, but she remembered my call to talk to her judge. And I talked to Buzz Arnold, and I said, "Look, Buzz, take my word for this. Hire this guy as your clerk. Just do it because I recommended it. You will thank me for it." And he did. And that gentleman, Marcus Cole, went on to be a law professor at Stanford Law School for many years. And now he's the dean of the University of Notre Dame Law School. He's doing a spectacular job at Notre Dame, building one of the strongest, best faculties there. And I'm very, very proud of him. That's one of the things that I've been able to accomplish. He is one of the things that I've been able to accomplish in my life just by doing a couple of things along the way. And so that's a story that I would like to have put in the memoir, but I actually did not have room for.
Oh, well, be sure, I'll tell Buzz that, and
And thanks for giving
I'll-
us the exclusive on that story.
Yeah,
Maybe.
And he did
and,
thank me later too.
yeah. Well, I will make sure that Buzz has a mechanism. He still gets together with his clerks quite frequently, so I'll make sure he has a mechanism to listen to our podcast, and so that he can listen to this and hear the story from you directly. So, speaking of how you do favors and you sort of kind of pay homage and to people that help along the way, and you talking out about Buzz, listening to you and you helping people as well. We do talk a lot about gratitude on this podcast. And I think one of the truly sort of most touching moments of your book was when you talked about, and I'm going to say the name probably wrong, so you have to correct me, is you give substantial credit to, is it
Lysander Spooner.
Lysander Spooner, who wrote The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. And so can you talk just a little bit about why his work was so remarkable?
Well, he was a remarkable individual, a very iconoclastic, singular person, relatively obscure, but not as obscure as people now say that he was obscure. He was a lawyer that grew up in Western Massachusetts in Worcester, read for the bar, came from a very poor family of 8 kids, and ultimately went west to make his fortune. He lost his money. He lost his shirt doing real estate investments in Ohio. But in Ohio is the hotbed of anti-slavery, the anti-slavery movement. I believe it was there that he probably was infused with this anti-slavery sentiment. So was Massachusetts, where he actually went back to. And well, in 1845, he wrote a book called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. And it was that book that is responsible for me becoming an originalist. Even though he wrote that in 1845. Now, some of you may think, well, what could he possibly have said about the constitutionality of slavery, unconstitutionality of slavery, 1845, before the 13th Amendment was enacted? And that was exactly my question, too, when I saw a citation to this, what I didn't even know if it was a book or an article. I didn't know what it was. I saw a footnote that mentioned it. Now, I recognized the name Lysander Spooner because when I was an undergraduate and I was I became a libertarian, he, as a radical libertarian himself, wrote an essay called No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, in which he attacked the United States Constitution as lacking appropriate consent. That was, by the way, in my mind when I was taking Larry Tribe's con law class, and I thought, well, this Constitution hasn't worked out so well. That was a point that Spooner made. He said, regardless of its true nature, says it really hasn't prevented what has come about. And therefore, what good is it really? It's kind of been a mistake. I remember that idea when I was taking Larry Tribe's class, but that's all I knew about Spooner. This one essay he wrote in 1860. Now I see this footnote. I didn't know he wrote anything else. I didn't know anything about him, except for the fact that he started his own post office for some reason, which he did. And so I asked my library to get me a copy of whatever this was. It turned out it was a 280-page book, and it was part of a 6-volume collected works of Lysander Spooner. I mean, I didn't know that. And I read it, and in the book, he identifies an alternative version of originalism that I had never thought about before. Prior to that, the anti-slavery people were arguing, the Garrisonians were arguing that the Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it sanctioned slavery. In 1840, when Madison's notes were made public for the first time, notes of the convention were made public for the first time, they used those notes as evidence to the fact that the framers intended to protect slavery. And a man named Wendell Phillips, a Harvard-educated student of Justice Story, William Lloyd Garrison's right-hand man, his law guy, wrote this book called The Constitution, a Pro-Slavery Compact, and it was based on excerpts from the Madison Papers. 2 years later, Spooner publishes The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, in which he says, we are not bound by whatever intentions the framers had. That was their business. We're only bound by the original meaning of the words they used. And since the words they used did not expressly sanction slavery, we are not bound by their malicious or negative or unjust intentions. And that's when I realized there was an alternative to what was at that time referred to as sort of framers' intent originalism, and that was original meaning originalism. I got the idea from Spooner. So Spooner had so I don't think I would necessarily be an originalist today if it hadn't been for Lysander Spooner. And think about that. He wrote this book in 1845. It was almost completely forgotten, except by niche historians. And that book came alive for me 150 years later, causing me to become an originalist and giving me a theory of originalism to further develop, which is the reason why at least all the judges and justices who now identify as originalists identify as original meaning originalists, basically Spooner's theory. So I wanted to pay homage to him, as you know, in the book. As you know from reading the book, I wanted to pay homage to him, not only by, including him in the book came years later, but years ago, before I left my position at Boston University, I kind of went in search of Spooner. I found his grave at Forest Hill Cemetery, and I noticed that his grave was not unmarked anymore, but in the 70s, a bronze plaque had been placed flush to the ground, but you couldn't see it unless you were looking for it. And then I visited his boyhood home in Athol, Massachusetts. And at the owners of the home gave me some nails that came out of the original structure when they were doing some remodeling. And then I found the apartment building that he lived in downtown Boston where he died. I didn't do anything about that last site, but with respect to the first two sites, as you know, I raised $10,000 with the help of a libertarian friend of mine to create and install a 6-foot granite obelisk made in Vermont, with Spooner's likeness on it at Forest Hill Cemetery with the cooperation of the cemetery. And that now stands there. And before I left Boston, the last thing I did was to put a marker on a huge granite boulder, split-faced open granite boulder, so it would not go anywhere, a big bronze marker designating Lysander Spooner's boyhood home as belonging to him. And that was installed with a big crane apparatus in Western Massachusetts in Athol. And that was my tribute to him. And I guess one of the lessons I learned that goes back to our discussion of mentorships, and that is that you should thank your mentors while you still can. I did thank most of my mentors while they were still alive, and some of them I missed, and some of them I realized were my mentors, and I only found out they passed away when I was writing the book, and I wanted to update their bio, and I realized, oh my God, this guy is no longer with us. So thank your mentors while you still can. And, do right by them. And I think I've done right by Lysander Spooner. He really is not as obscure anymore amongst law professors as he used to be. And I think in part due to my efforts to revive his memory.
Well, there's so much to learn and to talk about in your response. And I'll just focus in, not including, but I won't mention more about it, just the importance of history. What an illustration of going back to something that was written, as you said, 150 years or something, and finding the wisdom in it. And sometimes I fear that many of us don't remember that or don't talk about that enough culturally outside of academia. So I love that part, but I also especially love the gratitude advice. And I could not say it any better than you just did in terms of taking the time to thank people for the way that they've helped you.
Yeah, and I just want to, I guess, before we move to the lightning round two, make sure that you know, Randy, that Beth and I consider you a mentor. So, and express our gratitude. So we'll take that moment to do that and make sure that you know that that you have certainly been that to us. So, just a tremendous, sort of beacon of light for state courts.
That's wonderful to hear.
Thank
you so much. I really appreciate it. Means a lot.
Yeah. But we do want to ask one question before we go to the lightning round, which is the book left us craving for more. So are we going to get another book?
Well, I'm writing it now. There were some chapters not quite a number of chapters I wrote about my experience as a Cook County state's attorney. That's what district attorneys are called in Illinois. They're called state's attorneys. And I was a assistant state's attorney for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Chicago in the Criminal Prosecutions Bureau. And my stories and what my experience in the 4 years I was a prosecutor were so many and varied and complicated that I had to compress them to get them into this book. But then the book got so long and I had to bring it down to a publishable length. And even now it's actually still pretty long. I had to pull those chapters out and publish them separately. And I'm now working them up into a separate book, which is called Felony Review, Tales of True Stories of Crime and Corruption in Chicago, which is the experience that I had when I was there. Now that I have more space, no breathing room, I'm letting those stories expand a little bit. So, for example, I talk a lot about my time on Felony Review, the unit that exists in Chicago to pass upon all criminal felony charges. Chicago police can't bring felony charges without the approval of a state's attorney. There has to be a full-time 24/7 unit to respond to the police stations to evaluate these cases. I worked on this unit for 6 or 9 months, and it was one of the most interesting and stimulating parts of my job. But I decided, since one of our jobs was to reject cases, and we had a 60-some% approval rate. That means we rejected about 40% of the time we were asked for felony charges. I'm going to add a chapter now because I just was reading over my log. I fortunately have lost one of my 2 logbooks from when I was a felony review assistant, but I got one of them. And I was reading over my log, and one of the things that struck me were all the reasons I wrote down for why I rejected individual charges. Insufficient evidence of this, insufficient evidence of that, or, this is sort of, this story doesn't seem to hang up. And I wrote these all down. So I think I'm going to add a chapter in which I just list all my reasons for disapproving charges, as opposed to all the cases I approved in which I took murder confessions from the defendants who did it, all those stories. So I'm now going to let the story breathe some more, and I think it's going to be written for the benefit of future trial lawyers, students who think they might want to go into the criminal justice system or be trial lawyers, because I'm going to talk about the lessons I learned and the mistakes I made, as I do in this book, because I had some failures as well as successes as a trial lawyer. And I'm going to talk about them as well in the next book.
Well, my nephew just graduated law school, and if he passes the bar, he's going to start at a prosecuting attorney's office. So I already have him reading your current book, but I can't wait for him to sort of learn from your experiences in the next book.
So let me add, for those people who are thinking about buying this book, that because I had to take those chapters out, what I left in the book were some of the experiences I had as a student prosecutor, both in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, where we had a clinical program and I prosecuted misdemeanors there, but also in Cook County, where I interned for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for 2 summers. And during the summer between my 2nd and 3rd year, I was involved in an unbelievable case that actually seems like an episode of a television show. And as a student, I was involved from beginning to end of this saga, which I won't give away. But it's about a person who was wrongfully accused and who we exonerated at the end of the day, just before we were going to try him for attempt murder of a police officer. And I tell the whole story from beginning to end there to give the reader a sense of what it's like to be a prosecutor, even though it happened when I was a student. I decided I would leave that in because I considered it part of my legal education before I became a lawyer. But it would also give a flavor of what the next book is going to be like when I talk about what it's like to actually be in the criminal justice system. And as I tell my students, it's actually better than TV. The reality of practicing criminal law, at least when I was there, was better than the TV shows that inspired me to be a lawyer in the first place.
Well, that's really a nice departure from what we get asked a lot, unfortunately, which is your court like Judge Judy? And we have to say, not exactly, but it sounds, and sometimes ours is not as interesting as Judge Judy, but sometimes it is. So thank you for turning that around a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think we top Judge Judy, Beth. Well, let's move into the lightning round, which this is part of the podcast where we do sort of shorter answers to questions that may or may not have to do with our work. And so, Randy, we're hoping you're game and that you will participate. We won't make you go first, but I'll ask each question and we'll let Beth go, then Randy, and then I will answer. And so question 1, since we just wrapped up the summer of Olympics, what is your favorite sort of Olympic sport, Beth?
It doesn't have anything to do with my background, but I have always just enjoyed watching gymnastics. And I don't know if that's being a kid from Nadia Comaneci on forward to Mary Lou Retton, but I do love watching gymnastics. Randy, how about you?
My favorite
Olympic
Olympic sport is NFL football. Oh, wait a second. That's not in the Olympics. I actually don't like the Olympics, and I don't watch the Olympics. I do watch football.
All right.
That's a fair enough answer.
Well, so who's your favorite? All right. So who's your NFL team? We'll do
Oh,
an
NFL
audible.
team.
I'm a Chicago Bears fan. I mean, and this year we're so
Uh,
excited. I mean, to be a Bears fan can be trying. Let's put it that way. But I mean, I grew up, watching the Bears. I don't think I put this in the memoir, but I grew up in Calumet City, south of Chicago. And those days, the NFL games, the home games were all blacked out on TV. You couldn't watch them on TV. And so I remember one day with my brother climbing up to the roof of our single-story ranch house and taking the TV antenna and turning it towards South Bend so that I could pick up the Bears the Bears broadcast from South Bend, Indiana. And all I could get was a snowy screen, but I could get the audio. And I just remember the audio referring to Brian Piccolo, the running back, who ended up making a made-for-TV movie about his tragic bout of cancer and everything. But at any rate, that was one of my earliest memories of being a Bears fan, is being on the roof of my house, trying to watch the Bears when home games were blacked out.
Well, so I am also a gymnastics fan with Beth, but here's the thing, we all can tie together. This is how strings tie, is Simone Biles, who won all the, Olympic gold. She will be there on the sidelines cheering the Bears this year. So it all comes
So
together.
do you watch Hard Knocks also? So that they talk about her boyfriend, her husband, who's on the Bears, and how they let him go to the Olympics to watch his wife compete.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. Good American spirit. So this is a really hard question. Your favorite constitutional amendment, Beth?
It's like, what's your favorite child? How can you pick? This is a totally unfair question. We've never singled out a section of the Constitution, so I'm objecting. No, First Amendment.
Okay.
How can you not love the First Amendment? Everything about it. There's so much to it.
I have to say the Ninth Amendment, don't I? Aren't I obliged to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, because I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for that amendment.
Yeah. So, I think we don't have to, Beth, say our favorite. We can just, point out one that we, really care about. I feel like as a state court justice, I have to say the 10th Amendment, which says, all the powers not delegated to the United States go to the states and respectively to the people, so that we understand it's the people that ultimately have the power. So 10th Amendment. Beth, what type of law did you plan to do when you graduated law school?
I often said in my third year of law school that I wanted to do anything but having to do with litigation. Believe it or not. So I intended to be maybe some kind of transaction lawyer. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I did not anticipate becoming a labor and employment lawyer, and then certainly what I'm doing now. So it's funny how things happen.
My turn?
Yep.
Well, when I was 10 years old, a television show came on CBS television called The Defenders, which was a show about a father-son criminal defense team in New York. Very gritty, very realistic, filmed on location in New York in black and white, because lots of shows were in black and white then. And even though our family watched Perry Mason on Sunday nights, which was, about the lawyer, that didn't mean anything to me because it was about solving murders. It was not about being a lawyer, but The Defenders was really about the practice of law and the problems, the ethical problems and the moral problems that arose in the course of practicing criminal law. And it seemed to me at the time that was what being a lawyer was. And that's when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And I never really deviated from that path all the way through college and law school. I mean, in college, I did flirt with the idea of becoming a philosophy professor and getting a PhD in philosophy instead of going to law school. For reasons I describe in the book, I decided against, I rejected that idea and went to law school. But even though the sort of the impulse, or this is, by the way, turning into not a short answer, even though all the pressure or in law school is to have you, not waste your degree and try to get a job with a big law firm. I could not understand why anybody would want to do that kind of work. To be a real lawyer meant being a criminal trial lawyer. And so I just stuck to my guns, and that's what I got to be. I got to be a criminal lawyer in Chicago. I had considered being a public defender, and the main reason I decided against that was that, I mean, there were two reasons. One is that in those days, I think still today, the public defender's office was highly political. You needed political clout to get the job. You needed political clout to rise in the office. The prosecutor's office, the state's attorney's office at the time, was very non-political. A Republican was the state's attorney, and I didn't have any political clout, but nevertheless managed to get into the office and rise very quickly through the office without political clout. That was a practical reason. The principal reason was that prosecutor's ethical obligation is to do justice, and the defense obligation is to zealously defend their client. The second role is absolutely crucial and essential to the justice system. It needs to be done, but I was more comfortable with the idea that it would be my job to decide what the just outcome would be, and I was able to do that as a prosecutor. So that's what I wanted to be when I came out of law school, and I'm so glad that I stuck to my guns and did it, because it was enough that's going to fill another book.
Well, so I wanted to do employment law when I first graduated, and I did not end up doing it. And I think it ended up being the right path. So, sometimes plans don't work out. I think it's a good lesson because there's a greater plan. So,
Well, can I say something about that? Because I totally agree with that. Look at me now. I mean, I went to
Mhm.
law school to be
Yeah.
a criminal lawyer, and look at me now. I'm a constitutional law professor.
That's right.
And you
That's
just
right.
have to be able to follow your interests, and you have to also be able to seize upon opportunities that arise, even if they're not what you originally planned on doing. You need to be able to recognize an opportunity as an opportunity, and one that's consistent with your overall life path. It's not going to take you too far away from that, but it's not what you expected. And then you're prepared to sort of change your course and seize upon the opportunity. I think that's a really important life skill to have to be successful in life.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people don't even recognize the doors are opening for them because they just start staying on the one path. So the final question is, do you collect anything? And if so, what? Beth?
And so this is super obscure and weird, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway. So when you go to Starbucks, they have those in some Starbucks, they have the little mugs for different states. Like you can go and you get, if you're in Ohio, you get the little Ohio one. Well, because I've been traveling the country, trying to visit all 50 states Supreme Courts, I'm up to I'm up to 35 now. As I've done that, I've been collecting those little Starbucks, the little ones that I think they're supposed to be Christmas ornaments. I use them as espresso cups, but it's a weird thing to collect. But once I started going, and you can't get them, you can't you can't cheat and go on Amazon and I didn't get Hawaii, so I'll go. You literally can't find them on eBay. You just have to be fortunate enough to find them. So it's a very weird thing, but that's mine.
Sounds weird is good. Weird is better. I don't really collect much, but I think the two things that would qualify is mugs that have the places I've been or events that I've attended, or more primarily baseball caps that have something distinctive that is a memory or something. But unfortunately, there's not a good way to store and baseball caps. So they're all in a closet, they're kind of, it's hard to get to them. So I've kind of trying to swear off buying any more. And I tend to end up wearing the same caps anyway, and I don't go through my whole collection and wear them. But that would be the one thing I would say that I collect. And also mugs. I'm out of cupboard space for mugs, so I can't get mugs anymore either.
So Beth, I think knows I collect one books. I'm an avid sort of, in our house is running out of space, but and then the other thing is it's very sort of odd, a little unusual, but it's little emoji boxes, but they have to be like the real emoji box. And the same thing, you can't just go buy them. You have to randomly either stumble on them in a antique store or a flea market where someone doesn't know they're selling it, or so it's very much the sort of hunt in the randomness of finding one that makes it interesting. And
Randy is, we're on video and Randy's showing us
he's
his
showing us
mug,
his mug.
which is a tempt.
Ain't Too Proud,
Oh.
The Life and Times of the Temptations.
Great music, a
So
great
that's his
musical.
mug drinking out of today. But anyway, so it's kind of a, a little area. And I will say that as we're wrapping that, I think you have to read the book to figure out maybe why Randy loves baseball hats, because I feel like there's a story about that in the book, and I didn't really get it until reading the book. So I'll tease that out there for people to go read the book and find out.
Tell you,
about
I'm not going to say the
hats,
story, but that's one of the stories that I really wish to put in the new book, because it really relates to the new book, but I just don't think I can tell the same story in both places.
Yeah, you have to see if you can change it a little bit. But that's a wrap for this episode of Lady Justice, Women of the Court. We will make sure that you can find out more information about Randy and his book. We'll put that on our website in the script for the podcast. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Follow our podcast on any social media and podcast app. And thank you again for the National Center for State Courts for our partner in producing this. And Randy, it's been a pleasure. And Beth, it's always good to see you. And that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Lady Justice, Women of the Court. To learn more about the work of our nation's state courts, visit the National Center for State Courts online at ncsc.org. Follow Lady Justice, Women of the Court on social media and subscribe to the show on podcast platforms to receive notifications about new episodes.